They met the way most love stories begin, by chance, in the ordinary folds of everyday life. He was quiet but dependable, the kind of man who carried himself with a steady calm. And she was warm, full of laughter that softened even the hardest moments. Their first conversations were shy, simple exchanges that grew into late-night talks, promises whispered in the dark, and the kind of devotion that makes to strangers feel as though they had been waiting for each other their whole lives. Within a few years, that spark became something permanent. They married, surrounded by friends who toasted their future, and by neighbors who spoke of them as the couple who seemed destined to last. For 11 years, they lived in the rhythm of togetherness, their days marked by shared meals, the small rituals of marriage, and a bond that deepened with every obstacle they overcame. They celebrated anniversaries with candlelight and laughter, held each other through nights of uncertainty, and dreamed of growing old side by side. To everyone who knew them, they were the definition of love and loyalty to people who had built a life out of trust, sacrifice, and commitment. They believed they had escaped the world's cruelty, found a rare kind of happiness, and written their story with their own hands. Yet behind that harmony lay something they could never have imagined, a truth that waited silently in the shadows. It was a truth not written by them, but by choices made long before they ever met, choices hidden, buried, and whispered only in silence. For now, though they lived blind to it, unaware that every smile, every promise, every shared memory was perched on the edge of a secret that had been sealed away in the past. A secret that would one day rise like a storm and change everything. They thought they knew what family meant. They thought love was enough. But what if love had been built on a lie? What if their perfect marriage was tied to something darker than either of them could accept? The foundation of their life was strong, but the cracks had already been carved quietly, invisibly, and waiting for the right moment to shatter the world they had built together. For years, their home was a portrait of comfort, the kind of place where warmth lingered in every corner and silence never felt heavy. They cooked together in a small kitchen filled with the scent of spices. They laughed in living rooms where evenings stretched long, and they spoke about the future as if it were theirs to shape. Friends admired them, envied even, for the way they seemed inseparable, bound not only by affection but by an unspoken understanding that grew deeper with time. They weathered life's storms with a quiet resilience, holding hands through struggles that would have torn other couples apart, and celebrating victories as though they were proof that fate favored their union. To him, she was more than a wife. She was the center of his world, the one who gave meaning to long days and restless nights. To her, he was safety, the steady presence she had always longed for, someone who never let go no matter how difficult the path became. Their love was not a fleeting spark but a steady flame, one that seemed unshakable, eternal. Yet beneath the surface of that happiness, a shadow moved silently, carrying the weight of a story neither of them knew they belonged to. It was a shadow born long before their first meeting, before the vows, before the children, in a time when decisions were made in secret and sealed with silence. Long ago, there had been a man, his father, who lived two lives, one in the light and another in the dark. A man whose choices were hidden beneath layers of shame and secrecy, choices that tied strangers together without their knowledge, and set into motion a tragedy disguised as love. That man's secret would remain hidden for decades, passed through whispers and half-truths, waiting until it collided with the innocent lives of two people who believed they had escaped the cruelty of the world. They did not know that the happiness they built so carefully was rooted in soil poisoned by betrayal. that every promise they made was already tangled in bloodlines neither of them understood. For now, they slept peacefully, dreaming of a future that seemed safe, unaware that fate was already drawing its line, preparing to reveal what had been concealed for too long. And when the truth came, it would not knock, gently it would strike like lightning, ripping apart everything they thought they knew about love, family, and themselves. The years passed with ease, their life together becoming a kind of rhythm, steady and dependable. Each morning began with quiet smiles, familiar routines, and the comfort of knowing someone was always there. They had built traditions, Sunday mornings spent lingering over breakfast, evenings walking hand in hand beneath fading sunsets, birthdays filled with laughter and surprise. To anyone who looked in, theirs was the kind of marriage people longed for, one shaped by loyalty and softened by genuine affection. Even their arguments never lingered, melting quickly into apologies and renewed closeness, the kind of forgiveness that only comes from deep love. They were more than husband and wife. They were companions who had weathered storms and created light in the darkest of days. But while they believed their story had been written by their own choices, another hand had been guiding it all, a long and unseen hand that belonged to a past neither of them had asked for. Decades earlier, his father had made choices hidden in secrecy, living a life divided between duty and forbidden desire. In another corner of the world, there was a woman, her mother, who carried her own silence, a silence that concealed shame and longing. Their paths had crossed in ways never spoken of, and from that crossing a secret was born. Neither the husband nor the wife knew of it, and neither family dared to speak of it aloud. Generations had layered silence upon silence until the truth was not just forgotten but buried, thought to be lost forever. And so the two who should have known each other as family instead knew each other as lovers, spouses, companions, soulmates. The cruel irony was that their happiness was built on a lie so well hidden it seemed impossible to uncover. Yet secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. Sometimes they rise gently, in whispers, through old letters or rumors. But sometimes, as in their story, they break free violently, shattering lives in a single instant. For now, the couple's joy was untouched, but somewhere in the distance the storm was already forming, pulling together threads of past betrayals and hidden truths. And when it finally broke, their world would no longer be measured in years of love and laughter, but in the silence of disbelief, the weight of shame, and the horror of knowing the bond they cherished most was the one they should have feared. Their marriage, for more than a decade, was the kind that made others believe in love. They had been through sickness and recovery, through small failures and quiet triumphs, and each time they came out stronger, bound tighter. They shared inside jokes no one else could understand, had favorite places that belonged only to them, and carried a history of memories that had stitched itself into the fabric of who they were. Friends often said they were meant to be, and the couple themselves sometimes felt as though fate had guided them together, as though the universe had conspired to place them in each other's path. It was a love story that seemed simple on the surface, but in truth it was far more complex than they could have ever imagined, for fate does not give without also taking, and destiny does not reveal its full hand until the moment of collapse. Long before their first meeting, the seeds of that collapse had already been planted. His father, respected in public but divided in private, had carried on a secret affair that never saw the light of day. Her mother, lonely and bound by her own circumstances, had been part of that hidden world. What they shared was never spoken of openly, hidden behind locked doors and silenced by fear of exposure. And from that silence came life, a life no one acknowledged, a connection buried under the weight of shame. That connection was her. She was born into the world without ever being told the truth of her blood, raised without the knowledge that her existence was bound to a hidden betrayal. She grew up apart from him, unaware that somewhere beyond her reach was a half-brother, a boy who would grow into the man she would one day call her husband. The irony was sharp and merciless. What had been hidden to protect reputations and avoid scandal would one day resurface, not in whispers, but in revelation, tearing apart the innocent rather than those who had been guilty. For 11 years, the couple lived as though nothing was amiss, oblivious to the storm coiled beneath the surface of their lives. They thought they had been blessed, but in truth they had been cursed long before they even met. And the curse was patient, biding its time, waiting for the moment when the past would force itself into the present and reveal what should never have been hidden. The first signs of the storm came quietly, almost unnoticeable at first, like cracks forming beneath the surface of a polished glass. It began with conversations about family, stories told by distant relatives at gatherings, fragments of history that seemed ordinary until placed side by side. A name mentioned in passing, a place that felt strangely familiar, a memory recounted that made both of them pause. These were small pieces of a larger puzzle. Neither of them realized they were assembling. She remembered her mother once speaking vaguely of a man from the past, someone never named, someone always cloaked in silence, and he recalled his father's occasional absences, his tendency to guard certain chapters of his life. At first, they ignored these coincidences, brushing them aside as the strange overlaps that sometimes happen between families. But then came documents, sold papers, unearthed during the process of tracing their ancestry, records that revealed connections they had never expected. His father's name appeared again and again, linked to times and places that overlapped with her mother's life. At first, it seemed like nothing more than coincidence, yet the deeper they looked, the more impossible it became to ignore. What began as curiosity soon turned into unease, a gnawing suspicion that the truth beneath their history was not as distant as they wanted to believe. They had loved each other for more than 11 years, shared a life, a home, and the intimacy of marriage, yet the realization began to form like a shadow creeping at the edge of their vision. They might be bound by something other than love. The thought was unthinkable, too grotesque to accept, and so they resisted it, clinging desperately to the life they had built. But secrets have a way of demanding to be seen, and this one was relentless, pressing forward with each discovery, each coincidence that no longer felt like chance. They stood on the edge of revelation, their hands still clasped in the comfort of a love they believed was unshakable, unaware that the truth waiting for them would tear at the very foundation of who they were. The storm was no longer distant. It was gathering above them, ready to break, ready to reveal what had been hidden for decades, that they were not simply husband and wife, but something far more devastating. The day the truth began to fully unravel was not marked by thunder or spectacle, but by something deceptively ordinary: a visit to an office, the kind of errand most people forget by nightfall. They had been tracing their family roots, a project that started innocently, born from curiosity and the desire to pass a story of origin down to their children. They sat across from a clerk who sifted through faded records and official files, the scent of paper and dust heavy in the air. Names appeared, dates aligned, and places overlapped in ways that made their hearts pound in uneasy unison. The clerk, unaware of the storm his words would unleash, pointed out a record that linked his father and her mother. It was presented casually, with no thought of consequence, but to them it was as though the ground beneath their feet had shifted. They exchanged a glance, one filled with disbelief and silent denial, but something unspoken passed between them, fear, sharp and immediate. In the days that followed, they could not shake the gnawing suspicion. They searched deeper, pulling at threads that should have been left untouched, driven by the kind of dread that grows heavier the more it is resisted. Old photographs surfaced, letters tucked away in boxes, and with each discovery the walls closed in tighter. His father's handwriting matched notes she had seen among her mother's belongings. His father's presence overlapped with moments her mother had never explained. The pieces fell together slowly, brutally, forming a picture they could neither accept nor escape. Nights that had once been filled with laughter turned into sleepless hours of silence, the distance between them growing even as they lay side by side. Every memory they shared now seemed poisoned, every touch laced with uncertainty. Love, once their greatest refuge, had become a battlefield between what they wanted to believe and what they could no longer deny. And then, when the final proof came, when the undeniable connection between his father and her mother revealed itself in the stark clarity of documented fact, the silence shattered. The life they had built for more than 11 years crumbled in an instant, replaced by horror, disbelief, and the crushing realization that their marriage was not a love story at all, but the echo of a secret long buried and finally, mercilessly, unearthed. The revelation struck them with the weight of 1,000 betrayals, not only from the past, but from the present they had so carefully built. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, and all that remained was the sound of their own breathing, sharp and uneven, as though even air had become too heavy to carry. They sat together, the papers spread across the table between them like evidence. In a trial, each page whispering a truth they wanted to tear apart and burn. But truth cannot be destroyed once it is seen. They tried to reason, to explain it away as coincidence or clerical error, but the more they spoke, the more the walls closed in. Her eyes, once filled with warmth when she looked at him, now flickered with horror and disbelief. His hands, once so steady, now trembled as he held the documents that unraveled his life. Everything familiar, the home they had built, the children's laughter echoing in their walls, the years of love and devotion, was suddenly drenched in something grotesque, twisted, and unbearably cruel. In that moment, love became a curse. Every kiss a memory they wished they could erase. Every embrace a reminder of the forbidden blood that bound them. Yet there was also anger at the people who had created this hidden chain of events. Anger at parents who had chosen secrecy. Over truth, selfishness over clarity. The betrayal was not theirs, and yet they were the ones condemned to bear it. How could fate be so merciless as to allow them to live for more than a decade in a happiness destined to collapse? How could life let them love each other so completely, only to reveal that love as something unnatural, something that could never be undone? In the days that followed, silence became their companion. They avoided each other's eyes, afraid of the reflection they would see. Every touch felt like fire, every word a reminder of the truth they could not unhear. They stood on opposite sides of the same tragedy, bound together yet forced apart, living in a house that no longer felt like home. Their story, once admired by others as a tale of devotion and endurance, had become something darker, a story that could not be told. A secret that could never be spoken aloud without destroying everything in its path. In the stillness of their home, the air grew heavy, with things unsaid. Rooms that once echoed with laughter now seemed haunted, every corner filled with shadows of memories that had soured overnight. At the dinner table, silence stretched longer than words. Food went untouched, and glances that once carried affection now carried the weight of shame. Nights were the worst. They lay awake, staring into the darkness, their minds circling the same unbearable truth. They were not only husband and wife, they were brother and sister. The thought replayed endlessly, a cruel refrain that poisoned even their fondest memories. What once felt like destiny now felt like punishment, as though some invisible hand had been waiting for years to reveal the cruelty hidden beneath their love. They tried, at first, to push it down, to live as if nothing had changed. After all, they had been married for over 11 years. Their bond was real, their love undeniable. Could a truth buried in blood erase the life they had built? Could it undo every sacrifice, every shared dream, every hardship endured together? But no matter how they tried to resist, the secret gnawed at them, relentless and merciless. Each time their children called them mother and father, the weight grew heavier, the fear sharper. They could no longer look at each other without seeing the reflection of the past they wished had never existed. The walls of their marriage, once unbreakable, now trembled under the force of something neither of them had asked for. And in that fragile silence, questions began to rise. Without answers, who was to blame? Was it the father who had lived a double life, the mother who kept her silence, or the system that allowed secrets to stay buried for decades? Or was it fate itself, cruel and blind, weaving a tragedy disguised as love? These questions would follow them like shadows, pulling them deeper into despair. The marriage that once stood as their greatest strength had turned into their greatest torment, a reminder that sometimes love is not enough, and that truth, no matter how delayed, can destroy even the most unshakable of bonds. The truth did not come gently, arrived like a blade, sharp and merciless, through a revelation they could never have anticipated. It began with a medical emergency, their youngest child falling ill in a way that frightened them into endless hospital visits. Doctors ordered tests, not only for the child, but for the parents as well, searching for genetic links that might explain the illness. What should have been routine spiraled into something unimaginable. The results came back with words no one in the room was prepared to hear. The child's DNA carried markers that suggested inbreeding, a genetic overlap too precise, too damning, to be anything but the unthinkable. At first, they resisted, demanded retests, blamed error in the system, but each test confirmed the same brutal fact. The doctors, hesitant and cautious with their words, explained what the science could not soften. Their shared bloodline was too close for coincidence. The couple sat frozen, their hands gripping the edges of their chairs, unable to process the enormity of what had been laid bare. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the cold hum of machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses, the life they had known ended. Every document they had studied, every suspicion that had once lingered in the back of their minds, now crashed into undeniable reality. It wasn't rumor, it wasn't coincidence. It was science cold, objective, merciless. They were siblings. The world they had built together for more than 11 years collapsed in an instant. Love, once their sanctuary, now stood exposed as something forbidden, something that should never have been. The shock rippled outward, leaving them breathless, their child's illness now tangled with the horror of their own history. And while the doctors offered explanations and apologies, their words were meaningless. The couple had been living a lie woven not by their own hands, but by secrets long buried, by choices made in shadows decades before. The truth had not just unfolded, had been ripped open, raw and undeniable, through the blood of their own child. The hospital became a place they dreaded, not for the sterile halls or the endless tests, but for the eyes of strangers who seemed to look at them differently once the truth was whispered behind closed doors. What began as quiet speculation among doctors soon became an unspoken weight in every room they entered. Nurses, who once smiled, with warmth now averted their gaze. Conversations fell silent when they passed, and the couple felt the world closing in, trapping them in a cage of shame. They returned home with their child, but the walls of their house no longer felt like shelter. They were prison walls, echoing with questions that had no answers. Every photograph on the wall mocked them. Every memory seemed tainted. Every dream turned into a cruel reminder of the life they thought was theirs to claim. She found herself staring at their wedding picture, the smiles frozen in innocence, and wondered how fate could be so merciless as to let them live more than a decade in a lie. He sat in silence most nights, replaying every moment with his father, every detail that might have hinted at the secret he never saw. Anger grew in both of them, anger at the parents who had hidden the truth, at the silence that had allowed them to walk blind into disaster. Yet anger could not erase what had been revealed, nor could it heal the wound that now split their marriage in two. They loved each other, how could they not, after all those years? And yet they now carried a knowledge that turned that love into something forbidden, a truth that demanded separation but punished them with longing. For the first time in 11 years, they could not touch without trembling, could not speak without the shadow of bloodlines looming over their words. Their child's illness had been the key that unlocked the secret, but now the cost of that knowledge was unbearable. Every moment they remained together felt stolen, cursed, and yet how could they let go of a life built with such devotion? How could they erase more than a decade of memories because of something they had never chosen? It was a question neither dared to answer aloud, because deep down, they both knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. The nights grew heavier after the revelation, each hour stretching endlessly as silence pressed down on them. Sleep no longer came easily. When it did, it was fractured by dreams that twisted love into something grotesque, leaving them waking in cold sweats, unable to even look at each other without remembering the truth. The home they had built together, once filled with warmth, now felt like a graveyard of illusions. She wandered through rooms with hollow eyes, pausing at the sight of their children's toys scattered across the floor, and wondered what blood had passed into them, what legacy of secrecy had been forced upon innocent lives. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the reflection of a man who had unknowingly become both husband and brother. Their conversations shrank to whispers, to necessities spoken without emotion, because every word seemed to reopen the wound. Still, beneath the silence, there was something even more unsettling, the ache of love that refused to die. No revelation, no matter how horrific, could erase the years they had shared, the bond that had been real even if its foundation was cursed. They still felt the pull toward one another, the urge to reach out, to find comfort in the arms that had once been their sanctuary, but now those arms had become the very embodiment of their torment. Each moment together was a war between heart and mind, between the desire to hold on and the knowledge that they must let go. And yet, letting go felt impossible. How do you erase 11 years of love? How do you look at the person who has been your anchor, your partner in everything, and accept that they are now forbidden to you? It was a torment too great to name, a punishment handed down by choices made long before they were even born. Their love had been true, but truth had turned it into something monstrous. And though they did not yet speak it aloud, both of them knew the same thing. They were standing at the edge of a decision that would shatter their lives forever. To stay together meant defying the truth. To separate meant tearing apart not only themselves but the children who had known nothing but their parents' devotion. Either way, the life they had once cherished was already lost, and all that remained was the unbearable weight of deciding how to live with a truth that should never have been theirs to carry. The weight of silence could no longer be endured, and so they turned at last to the only living thread left to unravel the truth: her mother. His father was gone, carried to the grave with all the secrets he had hoarded. But her mother still lived, and though age had lined her face and softened her voice, she carried within her the truth that had poisoned an entire generation. They sat before her one evening, their hands clenched tightly, their questions heavy but unavoidable. At first, she resisted, feigning confusion, pretending not to understand the storm they carried into her home. But the documents, the hospital findings, the undeniable evidence pressed down on her until resistance crumbled. Her eyes lowered, and with a trembling voice, she began to speak words her daughter had never imagined hearing. She confessed to a secret long buried in her youth. Before marriage, she had been caught in an affair with his father. It was not love, she explained, but desire tangled with weakness, a relationship born in shadows, hidden from the world. When she discovered she was pregnant, he abandoned her, slipping back into the safety of his respectable life, leaving her to bear the weight of shame alone. Fearful of ruin, she carried her child in silence, and when she later married another man, she wove a lie so carefully it became her truth. She allowed her husband to raise the child as his own, never revealing the shadow that lurked in her past. For years, she lived behind that lie, convinced it would never surface, convinced that the silence would protect them all. But secrets, once planted, do not die. They grow, twisting silently until the day they force themselves into the light. As her mother spoke, the room seemed to collapse around them. The daughter sat frozen, unable to breathe, hearing her life reduced to a deception she had never consented to. The man she had called her father was not her blood. The man she had married was not just her husband. And the family she thought she understood was a construct built on betrayal. He sat beside her, his face pale, realizing that his father's sins had not ended with his death, but had reached out from the grave to poison his own life. The confession hung heavy in the air, a truth decades in the making, one that shattered every bond, every certainty, leaving them with nothing but the raw, unbearable knowledge of who they truly were. The silence that followed her mother's confession was heavier than the words themselves, as though the air had thickened with betrayal and grief. The daughter sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on nothing. It was as if her entire life had been rewritten in a single evening. The man she had trusted as her father was suddenly reduced to a role, a stand-in for another man's absence. The woman she had called her protector was now exposed as the architect of a lie so vast it had swallowed her very identity. She wanted to scream, to demand why, but no voice came. The husband sat beside her, rigid, caught between anger and despair. His father, the man he had spent years trying to honor, was no longer simply a father, but also the destroyer of his own son's life. He realized that love, loyalty, even family itself had been used as masks to cover sin, and now those masks had been ripped away. Her mother, frail in her old age, wept silently, but the sound of her tears brought no comfort. She spoke of shame, of fear, of being abandoned in a world that left her no choices. She said she lied to protect her child, to shield her from judgment, to give her a family name when otherwise she would have been branded with disgrace. But every word, every justification only deepened the wound. For what had been meant to protect had, in fact, condemned, had left two innocent souls to build a life upon a foundation of deceit. The daughter's heart broke anew, not just for herself, but for the children who bore the weight of this bloodline, for the innocence stolen from them before they were even born. The man felt fury rise in his chest, fury at a father who had hidden in respectability, at a mother-in-law who had silenced truth for decades, at the cruel fate that had forced them to live in ignorance until the truth could no longer be denied. Yet beneath the anger lay helplessness, the kind that robs a man of direction, leaving him drowning in questions with no answers. They left her mother's house that night in silence, the streets stretching endlessly ahead of them. Their footsteps echoed with the sound of a future shattered, every step a reminder that nothing could return to what it had been. And though they walked side by side, they had never felt further apart. The night air was cold as they walked back from her mother's house, but neither of them felt it. They moved like shadows, silent, each locked inside a storm of thoughts too painful to speak. Streetlights flickered above them, casting broken pools of light on the pavement, and for a moment it seemed as if the entire world had dimmed, conspiring to reflect the ruin of their lives. She replayed her mother's words again and again. Affair, a pregnancy, a lie wrapped in marriage, and, with every echo, her chest tightened until it felt like she could hardly breathe. The man she had called her father was no father at all, and the man she had chosen as her husband was bound to her by blood in the cruelest way possible. It was as if her identity itself had been torn from her hands, leaving her hollow and untethered. He walked beside her, his mind a storm of rage. Rage at his father, who had lived a double life and left destruction behind him. Rage at her mother, who had chosen silence over truth. But most of all, rage at fate, at the cruel design that had allowed him to fall so deeply in love only to find that love poisoned at its core. He wanted to scream into the night, to demand an answer from the heavens, but silence swallowed him whole. When they reached their home, the walls seemed to lean inward, suffocating, the memories that once comforted them now mocking. The photographs on the mantelpiece, their wedding portrait, the framed images of their children, all of it seemed to sneer at them, reminders of a love that had never truly belonged to them. She collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, while he stood rigid by the window, staring into the darkness outside. They did not touch, they did not speak. The bond that had once been their greatest strength now lay in ruins. And yet, beneath the devastation, there was still that unbearable truth that they still loved each other, even though that love had become forbidden. It was a love that could no longer be lived, but neither could it be easily killed. In the silence of that night, they both understood something they could not yet say aloud. From this moment forward, every decision would carry unbearable weight. And no matter what choice they made, the life they had once cherished was already gone. Morning came, but it did not bring light with it. The sun rose like a dim flame behind heavy clouds, casting a grey pallor over the world outside and inside their home. The weight of the truth still pressed down like a suffocating fog. The children stirred in their rooms, unaware of the storm, tearing their parents apart, their laughter piercing through the silence like a cruel reminder of innocence untouched by the sins of others. She moved through the kitchen in a daze, pouring milk into bowls, forcing a smile that felt like glass cracking across her face. He sat at the table, hands clasped, staring at nothing, the cereal before him untouched. Their eyes met once, and in that glance there was more than pain, there was shame, there was love, and there was the unbearable recognition that the person across from them was both everything they had ever wanted, and everything they could never have again. Later, when the children left for school, silence reclaimed the house. He finally spoke, his voice rough, as though the words themselves were made of broken glass. What do we do now? It was not just a question, it was a plea, a cry for direction in a life that had suddenly lost all meaning. She could not answer. Her mother's confession echoed in her mind. A secret affair, a child born into lies, a husband who was never truly a father. The truth had stolen everything: her family, her identity. Her marriage end left her standing on the edge of a void she could not escape. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she whispered, "We can't go on like this." The words hung in the air like a sentence, final and unmovable. He turned away, his chest tightening, because he knew she was right, but knowing it did not make it easier. Every part of him still longed for her, the sound of her voice, the way her hand had once fit into his, the life they had built together, piece by piece. And yet, every part of him recoiled, because to reach for her now was to embrace a truth that could not be undone. They sat in silence, the walls of their home heavy with memories, and for the first time in 11 years, they felt like strangers. Not because they had stopped loving each other, but because fate had revealed that their love had been written in a language they were never meant to read. That night, the house did not sleep. He paced the floor like a man trapped in a cage, his fists clenching and unclenching, while she sat curled on the couch, staring at the door as if she expected someone else to walk through and end this nightmare. Then, without warning, he grabbed the car keys from the counter and said, "I need answers. I can't breathe without knowing more." She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes, but she didn't stop him. He drove through the night like a man, possessed, the road blurring past, until he found himself parked outside her mother's house, the woman who had detonated their lives with a single confession. He banged on the door, and when she opened it, her face pale and tired, he didn't waste words. "You lied to her. You lied to all of us. I want everything, right now." The old woman trembled, but something inside her seemed almost relieved, as if the secret had poisoned her to 4 decades. She motioned for him to come inside, and there, in the dim glow of a lamp, she unfolded the past like a map of ruin. She told him about the affair, about how his father had promised love but left when pregnancy threatened his freedom, about how she had hidden the child by marrying another man and raising her daughter in silence. She admitted she had known the risk, had feared this very outcome, but she had clung to her lie, believing it would stay buried forever. He stood frozen, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. The truth was worse than he had imagined. His father had not been a victim of circumstance, but a coward who abandoned a woman and a child, leaving destruction to ripple decades later. His voice broke as he shouted, "Do you realize what you've done? You ruined our lives. You ruined her life." The old woman wept, covering her face, but her tears offered him no comfort. He stormed out into the night, his heart a battlefield between rage and despair. When he returned home, she was waiting for him by the window, her face pale with worry. He told her what her mother had confessed, every word hitting her like a blade. She sank into the floor, clutching her stomach, whispering, "All this time, my life was built on a lie." Their world was unraveling faster now, not with silence, but with fire, the kind that burned everything in its path and left nothing but ash. The days that followed felt like living inside a storm that refused to move on. Every room in their house seemed charged with electricity, every glance between them heavy with words left unsaid. He tried to distract himself with work, but his hands trembled on the tools, his mind looping back to the truth. She avoided mirrors, avoided her reflection, because when she looked at herself now, all she could see was a daughter born of betrayal. Then, without warning, the chaos burst outward. Her phone rang one afternoon, her mother again, her voice cracking through the line, begging, "Please don't hate me. I did what I thought was best." But instead of sympathy, it triggered fury. She screamed into the phone, her voice raw, "You stole my life from me. You took away my right to know who I was," and slammed it down so hard the glass cracked. He rushed in, grabbed her arms, but she pulled away, shouting, "Don't touch me. I don't even know who you are anymore." The words gutted him, but they were true. How could they still be husband and wife when blood bound them in a way that made love impossible? That night, neighbors heard their voices, not tender like before, but sharp, cutting through the stillness. "Of the street, we built a family," he roared. "We built something real." Her eyes glistened with tears as she whispered, "But it was never ours to build. It was built on someone else's lie." Then came the breaking point. She packed a bag, just one. Not everything, but enough to make the silence scream. He watched her shove clothes inside with trembling hands, and for a moment he thought of stopping her, of locking the door, of begging her not to go, but he didn't move. He stood frozen as she walked past him, her perfume mingling with the salt of her tears. At the door she turned, her voice shaking but firm. "I need time to breathe. If I stay here, I'll suffocate." And just like that, the door clicked shut behind her, leaving him alone with walls that suddenly felt too close, too loud, too filled with memories that were now poisoned. For the first time in 11 years, their house wasn't a home. It was a prison of secrets, and he was the last inmate left inside. She didn't vanish quietly. She fled like someone running from fire. Within hours of leaving the house, she was at her cousin's place, collapsing into the arms of a woman who had no idea of the secret she carried. But secrets don't stay hidden long, especially when they're this explosive. The cousin, confused by her trembling voice and tear-streaked face, pressed her for answers. "What happened? Did he hurt you?" And then the words spilled out, jagged and broken. "He's my brother. We didn't know, but he's my brother." The cousin froze, her hand dropping from her shoulder as if she had touched something. Cursed. That night, whispers spread through the family like wildfire: curiosity, disgust, disbelief. Phones rang, messages lit up screens, and by morning it wasn't a private tragedy anymore. It was gossip. Meanwhile, he sat alone in their kitchen, staring at a half-finished cup of coffee, when the first call came. His sister's voice on the other end, sharp and judgmental. "Is it true? God, tell me it's not true." He slammed the phone down, but they just kept coming. Each ring felt like an accusation, each unanswered call a reminder that their private world had shattered into public spectacle. By evening, he couldn't escape it. Neighbors knocked on the door, their eyes wide with a mix of pity and revulsion, offering fake sympathy but hungry for details. He didn't answer. He just sat in the dark, the sound of knocking echoing like nails against his skull. Then, as if the universe hadn't punished them enough, a letter arrived, handwritten, no name, no return address. Just one line scrawled across the paper, "Sins of the past always come home." He read it over and over, his pulse racing, until the paper crumpled in his sweating hands. He didn't know who had sent it, but he knew what it meant there. Story wasn't just tearing them apart. It was now entertainment for others, a scandal too shocking to stay buried. And somewhere out there, someone wanted to remind them that this wasn't just a family secret. It was a curse, and it wasn't done with them yet. The next morning, she returned not with forgiveness, not with calm, but with fury in her eyes. She stormed into the house, slammed the door so hard the walls trembled, and dropped a folded photograph onto the table in front of him. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through stone. He picked it up with trembling fingers. It was an old photo, yellowed with age, showing his father standing far too close to her mother, their hands brushing in a way that spoke of something more than friendship. He felt his chest tighten. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. But she didn't answer. Instead, she leaned in, her words like venom. "My mother admitted everything. He was with her before he ever married your mother. He left when she was pregnant with me. Do you understand what that means?" The room felt like it tilted, the floor slipping from under him. He stumbled back, the air leaving his lungs, and, in that silence, something inside him cracked. He dropped the photo, his voice breaking. "So all this time, the love we thought we chose, it was written in blood before we ever had a say." She didn't soften. She didn't cry. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Do you realize what that makes us? Do you understand how many years we've been living a lie?" He tried to reach for her, but she pulled back as though his touch would burn her skin. And then, before either could speak again, the front window shattered. A rock had been thrown, landing between them with a dull, heavy thud. Wrapped around it was another note, this one scrawled in the same cruel handwriting as the first letter. "Now everyone knows." They both froze. The world outside was no longer just whispering. It was watching, judging, circling like vultures. Their secret was no longer theirs, and the line between their home and the outside world had just been violently crossed. He ran to the window, peering out into the night, but the street was empty, too empty, as if whoever had thrown the rock had vanished into the shadows the moment glass shattered. His heart pounded as he gripped the frame, shards of glass crunching under his boots. Behind him, she picked up the note with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the jagged words again and again. "Now everyone knows." Her voice cracked, almost a whisper, but the weight of those words pressed down on them like a stone. He turned back to her, jaw clenched. "This isn't just about us anymore. Someone out there wants to destroy us." Before she could respond, a knock thundered at the door, loud, impatient, violent. They both froze, every nerve on edge. Another knock, louder this time. She shook her head desperately, whispering, "Don't open it." But he stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready for whatever awaited. When he yanked the door open, to Neighbors stood there, faces pale, eyes wide, holding a crumpled newspaper. Without speaking, one shoved it into his hands. Across the front page, bold letters screamed a headline that made his blood run cold. Married siblings. The secret that shocked the town. Their wedding photo was plastered across the page, cruelly juxtaposed with an image of her mother. And his father, labeled as proof of the forbidden link. The neighbors didn't say a word, didn't need to. Their silence was judgment enough. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as the paper slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor. She sank to her knees, clutching her head, whispering, "It's over. Everyone knows, everyone." But before despair could consume them, another sound cut through the room, a phone ringing. The shrill tone felt like a scream. He grabbed it, voice raw as he answered. On the other end, a voice spoke, low and cold. "You can't hide anymore. The truth is out, and soon it won't just be whispers. That will be the end of you both." The line went dead. They stared at each other in horror. Their private tragedy had just become a public spectacle, and someone was orchestrating every move. "Would you like me to push the next section into an even darker, more thriller-like, perhaps almost like a crime drama, or keep it focused on the emotional collapse of their marriage?" At first, it was just subtle, those quiet, cutting questions that slipped out in casual conversations, but carried weight heavier than stone. A co-worker asked him why he hadn't shown up at the office for a week, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. When he mumbled something vague about personal matters, a friend bumped into her at the market and, with a forced smile, asked why she and her husband looked so drained, why they had stopped attending gatherings they never used to miss. She smiled back, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, and she could feel the tension knotting in her chest as whispers followed her down every aisle. The walls were closing in, slowly, methodically. Neighbors began to notice. The couple who lived next door leaned over their fence one afternoon, their voices hushed but sharp. "Is everything all right? We heard something strange." Another whispered rumor passed to the other side of the block. People had seen the newspaper headline, and though they wanted to believe, it couldn't be true. The way the two of them withdrew from society seemed like confirmation in itself. Doors that were once open now stayed shut. Invitations that used to arrive weekly stopped coming altogether. The silence of exclusion became louder than any accusation. She felt it every time she stepped outside the eyes of mothers clutching their children's hands a little tighter when she walked by, the cold distance in greetings that once felt warm. He felt it too, at work, where even the boss who had once praised him now avoided his gaze. Conversations with colleagues cut short the moment he entered the room. The society they had lived in for years, the community they had once thrived in, was now turning its back, brick by brick, neighbor by neighbor. Questions were no longer whispers, they were sharp, spoken aloud, impossible to dodge. "Why don't you two come around anymore? Is it true, what they're saying? How could you not know?" Each question stabbed deeper than the last, not only reminding them of the horror of their truth, but also exposing how fragile the world around them had become. What once felt like a safe home was now a cage of suspicion and judgment. And yet, behind the questioning eyes and the sharp words, there was something else, growing in anticipation, almost hunger, for the couple's downfall. Society wasn't just judging them. It was waiting for them to crumble. It happened one evening, when the weight of silence was already unbearable. He had gone to fetch groceries, trying to avoid the piercing eyes of neighbors, when an old friend, someone he once trusted, stepped directly into his path. The man's face carried the kind of forced politeness that barely hides disgust. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Is it true, what people are saying about you and her?" For a moment, he froze. His heart raced, and the bags in his hands felt like anchors dragging him into the ground. He tried to deflect, stammering about rumors and lies. But his friend's eyes narrowed, cutting through every excuse. "Then why?" the man pressed. "Why do you avoid everyone now? Why won't you look anyone in the eye?" The air between them grew heavy, every word carrying the weight of judgment. Back at home, she wasn't spared either. A neighbor, a woman who used to sip tea with her on lazy afternoons, knocked on the door with feigned sympathy. "We're all worried," she said, her tone dripping with curiosity rather than kindness. "But tell me, how could something like this even happen? Didn't you know?" The words stung like knives, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she tried to explain, though no explanation could ever make sense of the nightmare they were trapped in. The friends' confrontations spread like wildfire. One question became two became 10, until the whispers transformed into open discussions, the kind that echoed in the marketplace and lingered in the air at church. No one was willing to say it directly to their faces, but everyone wanted to see them confess, to witness their shame in the open. What hurt most wasn't just the questions, it was the betrayal of familiarity. Friends who had once cheered their anniversaries now eyed them like strangers. Neighbors who once trusted them now warned their children to stay away. They weren't just isolated anymore. They were being cornered, pushed into the light, where their darkest truth could no longer hide. And with every question, with every pointed look, the inevitable was getting closer. The truth wasn't going to stay confined within the walls of their home. It was about to erupt. Publicly, brutally, and without mercy. The storm broke at a gathering neither of them wanted to attend, but felt forced to show up for. It was a small-town eventer, wedding reception for a distant cousin. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and silence spoke louder than words. They entered the hall quietly, heads lowered, hoping to blend into the background. But whispers spread like wildfire the moment they walked in. Chairs shifted, eyes followed, and the room's warmth seemed to evaporate. People didn't bother hiding their stares anymore. Some whispered behind hands, others muttered loud enough for them to hear. "That's them," someone hissed. "Living as husband and wife when they're blood." A man at the bar slammed his glass down and barked a laugh that felt like a slap. 11 years, and they didn't know. What kind of joke is this? She gripped his arm, begging silently for them to leave, but it was too late. The truth had grown legs, had a voice, and now it demanded a stage. A woman, older, sharp-tongued, and respected in the community, stood up. Her words cut through the hum of murmurs like a blade. "If what we've heard is true, then how can you still sit among us, pretending to be like the rest? We deserve answers." Silence fell. Dozens of eyes locked onto them. His throat burned, his pulse thundered in his ears. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. She tried to speak, to protest, but her voice cracked. The older woman pressed on, mercilessly. "Your father, her mother, people here remember things. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Tell us, is it true?" The hall erupted. Voices clashed, questions flew, and it was no longer whispers. It was judgment laid bare in public. The couple, trapped in the center of the storm, stood frozen. For 11 years they had been celebrated, loved, envied even. And now, In one brutal moment, they were being torn apart under the gaze of the very same people who once applauded their love. Their secret had become everyone's business. Their shame, a spectacle. And deep down, both of them knew life would never return to what it was before this night. They left that hall in silence, but silence has a weight heavier than any words. As soon as the door closed behind them, she broke. Tears streamed down, her face uncontrollably, each sob carrying the sting of shame, anger, and heartbreak. He tried to hold her, but she shoved him away, her voice trembling with despair. Why didn't we see it? Why didn't anyone tell us sooner? How did we end up living a lie for over a decade? His chest ached as though his ribs were closing in on his heart. He wanted to scream, to tear through the night with rage at the injustice of it all. They were not criminals, not monsters just, to people who had loved without knowing the shadow of their bloodline. But in the eyes of the world, they were tainted, and no amount of explaining could cleanse them. The house they returned to felt different that night, colder, emptier. Neighbors had left their curtains drawn, but behind the glass, he saw movement. The faint outline of bodies watching. Even their home had become a cage under society's gaze. The next morning was worse. They didn't go to work, too afraid of the questions waiting for them. But questions came anyway. A friend knocked, not with kindness, but with suspicion. "Is it true?" he asked, eyes darting between them as though he was staring at creatures he couldn't recognize. Another neighbor cornered her in the garden, voice dripping with mockery. "So, all these years, you didn't know who your husband really was? Or were you just pretending?" The cruelty was relentless. Even family members began to distance themselves, not out of disbelief, but out of shame. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. At the grocery store, mothers pulled their children closer when they passed by. They were no longer seen as a couple in love. They were whispered about as a scandal, a stain. In private, their nights grew darker. They barely spoke, except for broken sentences choked with regret. Their marriage bed felt haunted, every touch poisoned by the knowledge that once bound them. Together, now threatened to destroy them. And yet, despite the shame, despite the whispers, despite the walls closing in, there was still that unspoken bond, that 11 years of love that didn't vanish overnight. They clung to it desperately, but deep down, they both feared it wasn't enough to survive the storm. The storm outside their home was no longer just whispers and stares, began to take shape, to become something much harsher. What started as gossip among neighbors soon reached the ears of the local pastor, who called them in for a conversation. Sitting across from him, they felt as though they were children being scolded, even though they were grown adults who had lived in love for more than a decade. His words were sharp, almost merciless. "This is not just a mistake. This is sin, whether you knew it or not. The community will not look the other way." They left the church feeling branded, marked by something that was never their choice. But the weight grew heavier when rumors spread to their workplace. Suddenly, managers pulled them aside, eyes filled with discomfort. Co-workers who once laughed with them in the lunchroom now barely lifted their gaze. Then came the letters anonymous notes slipped under their door at night, scrawled with venom, disgusting. "You should leave, monsters." Each one cut deeper than the last, and though neither admitted it aloud, they both began to fear opening the door each morning. But the most devastating blow came when officials knocked. A man in a crisp suit, representing family services, stood on their porch with papers in hand. He explained that though they had no children, the state had to investigate the situation. He asked questions that made their stomachs twist, questions that reduced their love story into something vile. For the first time, he saw his wife look not just broken, but frightened, as though the walls weren't just closing in anymore, they were collapsing. Nights turned into war zones of silence, the kind where neither dared to speak the truth they both felt. Society wasn't going to let this go. Their love had been real, pure even, but the world had chosen to rewrite it as a crime. They weren't simply a husband and wife anymore, they were a scandal, a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner tables, judged in hushed tones from pews and offices. And as society closed in tighter, they began to wonder if their bond could survive in a world that refused to see it as anything but forbidden. First, they thought staying quiet would make the noise fade, that if they held each other long enough, the storm outside would eventually pass. But the truth was different. The quieter they stayed, the louder the world grew. So one evening, after yet another anonymous letter had been slid under their door, he stood up from the table and said, almost trembling but certain, "We can't keep living like this. We have to fight back." She looked at him, her eyes swollen from nights of silent tears, and for the first time in weeks, she saw the same fire in him that had once drawn her close. The next day, they did the unthinkable. They went public. They walked into a small newsroom in town, sat across from a skeptical journalist, and told their story without hiding a single detail. They admitted their ignorance, their years of love, their shock at the truth, and their refusal to be branded monsters for a fate neither of them had chosen. The article ran within days, a headline so explosive that it ignited the entire community. Some called them brave, others called them abominations, but at last, their voices weren't whispers on the street, they were words printed in black and white. The exposure didn't silence the storm, it made it wilder. Strangers began showing up outside their home, some shouting cruel names, others simply staring, as if studying a tragic exhibit. Yet, among the letters of hate, new ones arrived, to quiet confessions from people who had lived with secrets of their own, who wrote, "You are not alone." That paradox tore them apart and held them together all at once. For every stone cast, there was a voice that whispered in support. Society wasn't simply condemning them anymore, it was divided. They became a mirror no one wanted to look into, reflecting hidden affairs, broken families, and the uncomfortable truth that love often bloomed in places it shouldn't. And as they stood in that violent divide, they made a pact. If the world was going to try to erase them, they would leave a mark so deep it couldn't be forgotten. They would turn their tragedy into something larger than themselves, fight not just for their love, but for the right to define it on their own terms. The breaking point came one night when the constant knocking on their door, the endless stares from neighbors, and the whispers that seemed to follow them everywhere finally shattered whatever patience they had left. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the same table where they had once celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, the same table where their laughter had echoed freely before the storm. Now, silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. He looked at her and said, "If they won't stop tearing us apart, then let's stop hiding. Let's tell the world ourselves." She hesitated, fear flashing across her eyes, but then she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "We've lost everything already. What else can they take?" That night, they set up a camera in their living room, just the two of them, sitting side by side. No scripts, no rehearsals. The video began with her speaking, her voice calm but trembling. "For years, we lived as husband and wife. For years, we believed our love was pure. and it wasn't till we learned a truth we never asked for. He continued, his eyes fixed on the lens. We are brother and sister. We didn't know, we didn't choose this, but the love we shared was real, and we won't let anyone tell us it wasn't. Their words spilled out like a confession, like a purge of all the poison they had swallowed in silence. They admitted the shock, the pain, the betrayal of secrets kept from them. They spoke about the cruelty of being judged for something beyond their control, and they ended the video with a single plea. We are not asking for your approval. We are asking for your understanding. The upload button was pressed, and within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Millions of eyes watched, millions of mouths whispered, millions of hands typed furiously. The comment sections filled with venom and sympathy alike. Some accused them of sin, others called them courageous, and a rare few admitted they were moved to tears. The world finally saw their faces, not as shadows in gossip, but as human beings raw with pain and defiance. For the first time, the power shifted. It was no longer society controlling the narrative, it was them. But with that choice came a price far heavier than either of them could have imagined. Because once the internet had its grip on their story, it would never let go. The morning after the video went live, the air in their neighborhood felt different, as if the quiet streets themselves were holding their breath. Phones buzzed endlessly, and news outlets had already picked up their story. Headlines screamed words like married for 11 years, only to discover they are siblings, and the forbidden love that shook a community. Overnight, their private pain had become public spectacle. At first, they thought maybe this honesty would finally set them free, but freedom was not what came. Friends who had once laughed with them at dinners now avoided their calls. Some sent messages that were half pity, half accusation. A co-worker of his texted bluntly, "Don't come back to the office. People are talking. It's too much." Her job didn't survive either. Clients quietly withdrew, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Even walking outside was unbearable. Neighbors who had once borrowed sugar or shared smiles at the mailbox now pulled their children away, their eyes darting like they were staring at criminals. But there was something even stranger unfolding, because beyond the disgust, beyond the shame, the story had taken on a life of its own. Commentators on podcasts and YouTube channels debated them as if they were characters in a drama rather than real people. Memes spread mocking their video, yet just as many supporters defended them, calling them victims of secrets kept by their parents and the cruelty of fate. Thousands of strangers filled their inbox with messages, some cruel and vile, others heartbreakingly empathetic, saying things like, "Your story made me cry. You didn't deserve this." And then came the interviews. Media companies, documentary makers, even talk shows reached out, offering money if they would tell their story on camera. They refused at first, wanting to protect what little remained of their sanity, but with their jobs gone and their savings dwindling, the offers became harder to ignore. Their lives were no longer their own. They belonged to the world, dissected and consumed like a tragic play performed for an endless audience. What had begun as a desperate attempt to silence gossip had now elevated their suffering into something global, and they began to realize a chilling truth. In a world so addicted to scandal, no confession ever leads to peace, only invites more eyes, more judgment, more chaos. The global attention became suffocating, a pressure that no amount of love or resolve could hold back. Notifications never stopped, phones vibrating endlessly, emails piling up, strangers tagging them in posts. messages flooding in multiple languages. The world had become their jury, and every person with an opinion felt entitled to weigh in on a life they had no right to touch. At first, they clung to each other, trying to find solace in shared pain, but even that began to crack. Every glance, every gesture was filtered through the knowledge of their blood connection and the unbearable public gaze. Arguments that would have been small once escalated into shouting matches, fueled by exhaustion, fear, and shame. "We can't even leave the house without someone judging us," she screamed one night, her hair damp with tears. He could only nod, jaw tight, fists clenching at the counter. Yet somewhere beneath the despair, a flicker of defiance remained. They realized that if they stayed silent, the world would tell their story for them, twisted, mocking, exaggerated. And so, after long nights of planning, trembling hands, and whispered strategies, they agreed to appear publicly. They chose a live stream, a platform where millions could watch and listen simultaneously. Sitting side by side, her hand gripping his, they addressed the world with raw honesty. They explained everything: the love, the shock, the betrayal, the years of innocence, stolen not by their actions, but by circumstances beyond their control. They admitted the shame and fear they felt, but also the humanity that remained, the bond that still tied them together in memory, even if it could no longer exist as love. The comments flooded in, instantly, some vicious, some compassionate. They read fragments aloud, voice cracking, trying to absorb the enormity of their situation. After hours of speaking and listening, they finally ended the stream, hearts pounding, minds numb. It wasn't the relief they had hoped for. The world was still watching, still judging, but for a fleeting moment, they had reclaimed their story from gossip, rumor, and speculation. For the first time, they spoke on their own terms, even as the storm outside their home and inside their minds raged stronger than ever. The relentless scrutiny began to eat away at them like acid, invisible but utterly destructive. Each day brought new messages, new accusations, new reminders that the world refused to look away. Even in the safety of their home, they felt exposed. Every sound outside, every glance through a window, every notification on a phone was a knife to the chest. They stopped sleeping in the same room. Nights became a battleground of silence and muttered resentments. She would wake in the middle of the night, heart hammering, convinced someone was outside, waiting to mock them. He would pace the floors, muttering fragments of frustration and disbelief, unable to calm his mind. Even small disagreements, escalated words, once harmless now, ignited storms. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she snapped one morning. "Like what?" he shot back, voice trembling with pent-up fury. It wasn't really about looks, it was everything. The shame, the exposure, the impossible knowledge that no matter how much they tried, the world refused to forgive or forget. They began avoiding mirrors. Their reflections had become reminders of a past and a truth that had turned their love into something dangerous. Friends stopped calling, colleagues avoided them, neighbors whispered, and the media never relented. Every post, every comment, every viral clip of their video replayed the tragedy over and over in their minds. Slowly, their bond, the 11 years of love, trust, and shared memories, began to fray. They still loved each other in fragments, but love now came wrapped in fear, guilt, and exhaustion. Their lives had become a living nightmare where each breath reminded them that innocence no longer mattered, and the world had no intention of letting them forget it. And yet, even in the depths of despair, there remained a twisted loyalty and acknowledgement that no matter how broken they became, They had survived the impossible together, and that fragile thread, thin as it was, kept them from being completely lost. Years later, the house still stood, but it was no longer a home. It was a monument to secrets, love, and ruin. Curtains hung heavy and unmoved, dust settled on once bright frames, and the air smelled faintly of memories that refused to fade. They were rarely seen together anymore. When they did appear, it was like two shadows passing in a world that had already judged them, dissected them, and moved on to the next scandal. The world had consumed their story, chewed it up, and spat it out, leaving them hollow yet unwilling to disappear completely. She walked through rooms where laughter had once echoed, fingertips tracing the outlines of photographs that had become relics of a life that no longer existed. He stood by the window, eyes fixed on the streets below, remembering how whispers had once become shouts, how curiosity had transformed into cruelty, how love had been redefined by a single, devastating truth. Occasionally, letters arrived, some filled with sympathy, others with malice, all reminders that the past could never be buried. The bond between them had changed, to no longer the pure, innocent love of 11 years ago, but a connection, forged in shared trauma, in surviving what the world had made impossible. They spoke little, but in those rare moments, there was understanding, a recognition of a shared history that no one else could touch or comprehend. And yet, even in the silence, the story lingered, haunting not just them, but everyone who had watched it unfold. It became a cautionary tale whispered across towns, read on screens, debated in hushed tones, a tragedy of love, ignorance, and the cruel hand of fate. The final scene of their lives was not one of reconciliation or peace. It was a quiet reckoning, a reminder that some truths are too heavy for happiness, too explosive for society to accept, and too intimate to ever fully escape. And as the wind swept through the empty streets outside, carrying the echoes of questions, judgments, and whispers, one fact remained unshakable. They had loved, they had suffered, and the world would never forget it. The curtain fell on their story, leaving behind nothing but shadows, memories, and a haunting reminder that love and blood sometimes collide in ways the heart can never prepare for.